Hello and welcome to our round 13 game review of the World Chess Championships between Gukesh Maraju and Ding Liren. And we'll dive right in. Gukesh, after a rest played pawn e4, diverging from his other rete with knight f3, d4 and c4 in various combinations, even Catalans with d4. And as a result, e4 definitely would have been somewhat prepared following said rest. It was a little bit of a surprise that Ding repeated his French defense. Of course, in round one he played this, he did win, but clearly Gukesh would have been prepared for this, knowing it would come, very likely. There followed d4, d5. The exchange would have been a bit more placid, as we saw in earlier rounds, but still with some venom. So, knight c3, entering regular main lines, knight f6, e5, knight fd7, placing pressure here. And of course, in round one, Gukesh had played f4, supporting this, really going for it with the knight coming out, throwing forward the kingside. But here, he played a safe and sound knight ce2, very common idea in the so-called Steinitz variation, where white attempts to reinforce their center with a pawn chain and connect 4. And that is exactly what happened. c5, c3, the whole premise of knight ce2 prior to c5, is to try and solidify d4. And after knight c6, well, at this moment, f4, knight f3, all very common ideas seen hundreds of times before. Defending the center would have been what Ding was expecting after knight c6. You know, for example, f4, knight f3 to follow, bishop e3 as well. White knows what they're wanting to do, but also knows the defensive plan of defending here. Meanwhile, mitigating perhaps against bishop e3 with the b2 pawn, maybe being a bit of a target as well. However, Gukesh played the move pawn a3, and this sent Ding into a bit of a think, because played very quickly, under 1 minute, to Ding's 80 seconds or so. Clearly both sides knew this position, but after a3, Ding spent about 15 or 20 minutes on bishop e7. Well, this is the common move against other plans with f4 and knight f3 in various combinations. But he would just spend a moment thinking, what do I do against a3? Is there any b4 idea, perhaps? Of course, queen a5, as was played in earlier games, or the earlier game in game one of this match, could now be met with b4, which might, now it's defended twice, be a bit more venomous. Not right now, but that's the point. It's prophylactically preparing for that. And also simply to hold onto the pawn in some lines. So definitely a less common move, perhaps, with this idea. But also just defending b4, if nothing else. So all those ideas were definitely on Ding's mind. Bishop e7, and of course, bishop e3 played very, very quickly. It's worth noting f4 and knight f3 are still possible here, and it would transpose, but Gukesh clearly had other ideas. And at this moment, Ding could have played a5, and logical play could have continued, for example, knight f4, a4, grabbing said space. The downside of these moves, of course, it does weaken the light squares. Black may have to take time with the bad bishop to demonstrate that, but that is the long-term plan throughout the French defense. Endgames may well favor black. And possibly a consideration was that after bishop d3, queen a5, perhaps even in Gukesh's notes, was this very nice king f1. Relatively thematic idea, perhaps, but also just practical chess, avoiding the pin. We saw this in game one, where the king could have moved to f2 and so on. So it makes sense that in a very similar pin scenario, king f1. Of course, we like to castle in chess, but with the center closed and this king actually being very safe, it could even in the future hide on g2, but it's also not really in danger on f1. And meanwhile, of course, if black ever castles even, white will have a lot of play. So if both kings are semi-stuck in the center, then king f1 is a perfectly viable move, and it has the specific purpose of allowing, for example, this with c takes, and this would help white's structure hugely, clarifying things. Defending the knight can come to here, or perhaps to e2, and so on and so forth. That did not happen, so we'll retreat back to the main line, well, the game in fact, because at this moment Ding spent quite a while and played the move knight b6, 40 odd minutes. specific idea of knight c4. Worth noting, if this were to be captured, then knight c4 is just too much for white. If they try and construct this, at minimum there's this dropping, but there's also crippling the pawn structure with the other knight taking on e5. In any case, very bad, and if bishop c1 is therefore forced, then of course white doesn't win a pawn and black gets very good knights. For that reason, knight f4 was played, and well, let's just look at the times, of course. Gukesh has used under 4 minutes to Ding's 56 minutes, and well, as usual, Ding has had to adapt to Gukesh's very, very good and deep opening preparation. But in the next few moves, well, now the moves come quickly. C takes d4, pawn takes back, and knight c4, and well, this does attack here, and it's a very likely good move. And very quickly to approach this graphically, if we look at this graph just here, in place of myself, we have moves 0 to 15 on the x-axis, and 2 hours down to 0 on the y-axis. And we can see that on move 5, as we've just seen in the game, Ding, in the black line, spent over moves 5, 6, and 7 quite a bit of time. But then at just above an hour, hovering there, uses very little time. Of course, it's all forcing moves, as we'll see, but it really shows, once again, Ding adapting to Gukesh's very strong opening preparation, spending his time but working out the good moves nonetheless. And as we'll see in the coming moves, as the graph shows, Gukesh's red line starts to converge in the next half dozen or so moves towards Ding's time. Returning to the game and myself, we will see that now Gukesh captured the knight on c4, because if they didn't, this is just too much of a problem. There's loads of checks and checks using said pins if they were to retreat, to defend. For that reason, off with its head, taking the knight. And after d takes c4, there followed knight ge2, just developing, defending, and so on. And it's worth noting, queen g4 was certainly a possibility that, well, would be a different conversation. Otherwise, the knight cannot take because of castle's queenside. The check doesn't really do too much. The queen defending and attacking leaves the rook attacking, and we see a double attack on g7 and d8. So the king will move, so will the queen, and then there's various issues with knight h5, queen takes g7, and such and such. And with this king stranded in the center and this king relatively safe behind 2 pawns, there's only one winner here. But knight ge2, so possible chance of queen g4, slightly missed, but very safe move of knight ge2. And Ding played b5. Now it's worth noting, with the bishop pair now, having won the light squared bishop, f6 is certainly possible, but it is really playing with fire because, of course, this king's already, as we just saw, potentially unsafe in the center, so opening it up before it's castled could be risky. But the specific idea is that, well, this is threatened, so if knight h5, for example, then black can semi-ignore this and just capture and win the center. If this goes king f7 and the knight's forced to retreat, there's no decent way. This knight blocks the queen from helping. And then, of course, here, black's very happy, as far as can be. So, for that reason, perhaps captures is forced, bishop takes f6, just solidifying, and there's a lot of pressure with e5 coming, and the bishop would have opened up. So, a potential idea not played by Ding. But of course, b5 instead of f6 protects the pawn, makes a lot of sense. This is the problem, French defense bishop, but now it's coming to b7. Also, now, essentially 3 versus 2. This could be a very big thing for black to play. At the very least, counterplay, but potentially just trading off as well into, as we'll see, some endgames that may or may not be drawn. For that reason, b5, a very nice move, solidifying. Castle's kingside. Castle's kingside. Now white's blinked. Black can oblige as well and put their king behind 3 pawns. With this queen being blocked by the knight, knight h5s are that much less venomous and takes a bit of time. So Gukesh prepared their position. And notice, Gukesh, of course, has 1 hour 40 to Ding's 50 minutes. And after this, 1 hour 25, and as we saw in the graph earlier, very much the time starts to get more and more equalized. Rook b8, and well, all played incredibly quickly, 1 minute on the clock, defending, It helps as well. There's simple moves to play. Knight c3 attacks. Ding wants to play a5 and b4, so doesn't waste time with a6 and doesn't put the bishop on a6 as well, which would be not ideal. And they simply develop the rook to attack. So it's a very logical move with tempo almost. Knight h5, and already there's only about at most half an hour between the two players, and for that reason, clearly the complexity of the position, Ding, having spent some time earlier on, worked out some of the minutiae, perhaps Gukesh having to match him now and work out what his plan is to prove the advantage, and he chose knight h5, positioning his pieces first and then perhaps getting ready to strike. And so f5 was played, stopping queen g4, and of course, well, if white left it to perhaps play d5, then black could solidify, and this pawn is very annoying, stopping entry points for both the knight and the queen. And yes, white has opened it up in the center a little bit, but this bishop could sit very happily on this square, and if, for example, this knight coming back to the center, then the bishop can trade itself off, and in this position, this pawn's constantly weak, and black would be relatively happy, as all things can be considered. For that reason, the move en passant, meaning in passing, where when a pawn moves 2 squares forwards, this pawn can take in passing on this one move and one move only. If, for example, white played any other move, we'll play h3 and black plays h6, now en passant, as we can see, is not possible. So that's how en passant works. It's a one-time only move when pawns have got to the enemy half of the board and pawns try to move 2 squares forwards on their first move. In passing, they can capture en passant. So at this moment, en passant was played and the bishop recaptured on f6. And at this moment, perhaps capturing, removing the defender, but mobilizing the queen. And Gukesh said in the press conference that he had been analysing this position and could not quite work out after all of these captures. Queen to e6. He knew he was better, but he was looking for more, and things have traded off. Perhaps after rook fd1, queen takes, rook f5. He was worried black was getting very active, just defending b5, and things are trading off opposite colour bishops. There's quite a high draw margin for sure. So instead, backtracking to the game, queen f3 was played, staring down at some discoveries, but of course with the immediate attack, this is on. So for example, bishop d4, we just win a piece, and that would be game. And the queen can move to here, threaten some things on g7, and it maybe forces bishop to b7, which could disrupt the defense, pending discovered attacks, of course. Queen e8, played once again astonishingly quickly by Ding Liren in just 3 minutes or so. And in the last few moves, Gukesh has burnt a lot of time and is only 2 minutes higher than Ding's time. It's move 17, there's 23 moves to make, so we're under the 2 minute move margin, getting ever closer to the 1 minute per move. Let's see how this progressed. Queen e8, a very nice move, and it defends attacks, tethers the queen to here, and that means this is a problem. So, remove the liability. It does, however, sort of justify the rook on the open f-file, defending. The eternal problem in the French defense is the bishop's stuck, the pawn is a weakness perhaps, but actually, well, white's going to be playing d5, liberating and opening files potentially. Let's see what happened. Queen e2, putting pressure on this weakness. It's a backwards pawn perhaps. If e5, then d5 just discombobulates this knight, and this is not possible. Undefended queen, all thanks to the still yet to move French defense bishop on c8. So that's not possible. And so after queen e2, instead, queen g6, mobilizing, potentially. There's definitely some hope to mobilize the bishop, so white does need to play quickly. If black were to be given just a couple of moves to reorder their position, then the knight or bishop could land on d5, and there's definite good knight versus bad bishop scenario, even at the cost of a pawn for black. This construction here would not be favouring the bishop. It's just a very bad bishop. The knight can hide on d5. For that reason, f3, just slowing that down, defending here. And rook back to f8, and perhaps black should have been looking to develop the bishop. The problem is the b5 square would be under attack, And if, for example, knight e7, then bishop f4, as we'll see in the game, is a very nice tactic. Even bishop f2, the point is it's very hard to reorder said pieces. However, rook f8, just retreating, backwards move. Perhaps the rook was useful here, but nonetheless. Rook a d1, bringing pieces to the center, and knight e7, and here we have a very, very nice move by Gukesh. With about 6 or 7 minutes more than Ding, he spent just a few seconds on bishop f4, a very, very nice move he'd clearly worked out in advance. The idea is to get the bishop to this diagonal, attack the rook, and of course, if it is captured, well, feel free to pause the video. There is a counter move here that makes this not playable. Well, if you found it, it is queen e5, looking at the undefended rooks, and they are just unable to connect in any way. And white would have won the exchange because next move, one of the two rooks will drop off the board. Whatever black plays even, white's pieces are all defended, and so very, very safe. There's a slight issue with g2 I would be aware of, but it's not an issue because there's nothing but the queen looking at it. For that reason, white's pieces are safe, black's pieces are not. For that reason, bishop f4, fantastic move. Gukesh was looking to move in for the kill. And rook b6 was met incredibly quickly by bishop c7, hitting the rook, and Gukesh was clearly increasing the pressure on the clock. 31 minutes to 23 minutes with, this is move 23, so 17 moves to make. Not too great for Ding's prospects here. Rook b7, of course, actually not necessarily the best move. Perhaps rook c6 would be more accurate, maintaining defense and preventing bishop d6. Of course, Ding perhaps was worried about b5 dropping, but nonetheless would have been much better protecting squares. But after rook b7, bishop d6 even, there's some quite annoying issues. That rook e8, again, possibly needing to come to f7 just to solidify the 7th rank. But I can understand why Ding really wanted to protect the back rank. He has one rook doing this, and perhaps keeping one rook doing this makes a lot of sense. But nonetheless, this would be marginally better. But the pressure is already on, even after rook e8. Well, this is the worser move of the two, but it's very much better for white at this moment. So Gukesh with these very quick fire bishop moves, showing his class, showing perhaps he is world champion material. Let's see what happened. Bishop takes e7, rook e takes e7, and queen e5. So trading off the bishop to enter into a potentially good knight versus bad bishop, and I think it's fair to say this bishop is not liberated at all yet. There's a lot of issues. If it goes to d7, there are too many issues after d5. The rooks do need to maintain contact, so that's not possible. And if it can't come out to defend, a6 to just connect the pawns here. And d5, trying to maintain pressure. Of course, as happened, if e takes, this does liberate the bishop somewhat. There's definite ideas here, but there's always rook f2s against such ideas, and there's not time. This is a check, and the pressure is still on. This is not the safest of pawn structures, so white's still got a huge amount of it. Although, queen e6, things are trading off. However, the critical moments are coming up. After queen c5, keeping the queens on. If the queens came off, not every endgame, but certainly this may be one of them. White does have the central play, and the bishop has no targets. But ultimately, black feels a lot safer with their king, with the queens off the board. And a5, b4 will be coming, forcing trades in some way. And black wouldn't be in any way in danger anymore. Instead, queen c5 saw rook e8. And after rook d-e1, a very classy move, as we'll see. Ding at this moment should have traded off into this endgame, where the queen versus two rooks, although it looks like there's a lot of issues because of the check and because the rook can retreat back and defend, even if, for example, queen c6, the rooks can reorder themselves, the knight can come in. Certainly queen and knight versus two rooks and bishop is a lot more venomous than other piece configurations because the queen has help and the knight and queen are very powerful. But because of these rooks showing a lot of coordination with checks and stuff, it's worth saying the king can go to g3 and hide quite well. But because these rooks are quite well ordered, black would have been okay. Instead, Ding retreated with the queen to f7 at this moment here. And there followed, well, feel free to pause the video, in fact. What would you play as white here? It's a very tricky moment. And the best move, well, if you found it, would have been rook takes rook, queen takes, and then knight e4, because now this is not as defending on the 7th rank, and this family fork, albeit only 3 pieces now, as we'll see in the game, it will be attacking 4. But here, it's semi-impossible. For example, queen d7, knight d6, rook b8, and after queen to a check, the king has to step over, and this would have been very nice, a lovely octopus knight dominating the position. However, if we go back to the game, knight e4 immediately, this is instead of rook takes e8, knight e4 immediately was played. And once again, feel free to pause the video because there is a saving move here, and Gukesh had missed it. Ding even hovered his hand over the wrong move about to play it and saw that some bad things could happen. The move he had been about to play was rook c7, but knight f6 striking would have won the game. The queen is overloaded and cannot defend in red here. Either the pawn takes, and like this, and the queen and the rook will drop because the queen is like this, and of course the same thing would happen if the king moves. The rook will be dropping with check. For that reason, rook c7 is not possible, and well done if you found this move a moment ago. It is rook f8, found by Ding, very short on time, of course, 5 minutes versus 13, and this started the comeback. At this moment, Gukesh has been outplaying Ding quite considerably, but after rook f8, everything started to change. Because at this moment, now, if the same thing happens, well, there's no rook on e8 to be lost. And, of course, if white steps in with knight d6, then rook c7 now does work because there's no issues with this, or indeed a check, because there's no rook on e8 for the queen to have to defend, so the queen can stay defending c7. So a very accurate moment by the world champion, and it shows how he managed to save this game. Let's play on. Queen e5, maintaining the center, and already a lot of Gukesh's advantage has evaporated. And now this bishop is freed. The crucial moment was a few moves ago when perhaps this knight coming to d6 could have come at a more favourable opportunity. Now, however, the queen moved. Of course, both queens were under attack in said moment. So this queen moved, so did this queen. And Gukesh declined the trade. It's worth noting there's no smothered mate possibilities. For example, if knight f7, we simply take with this rook. The power of this lateral rook means that the rook will stay covering e8 and now the queen. So that's not possible. So Gukesh lifted his rook up, still playing for the win. This is a powerful knight, but the worst is over for the world champion Ding Liren. Rook to e7, trying to trade rooks makes a lot of sense. The more pieces that come off, the less pressure against this king. Rook fe1, captures and captures. And now a safety first move, h6. Very sensible, giving the king safety from any potential back rank ideas. Knight f7 was not actually really threatened with the rook able to come to here, but h6 really puts pay to any possibility like that. Meanwhile, white's king, of course, is potentially more exposed to checks because the f-pawn rather than the h-pawn has moved. Regardless, queen c5, and it's a downward stretch for Ding Liren. The worst really was over. Bishop d7, it was attacked, only defended once versus 2 attackers. Knight back to e4, just putting the question to this queen. But queen f4, and it was at this moment that Gukesh played rook e7 on his 39th or 40th move, in fact, leaving Ding to complete the first time control with 2 minutes remaining, and he did so relatively quickly with bishop f5. choosing activity over anything else. And of course, if the bishop comes off for the knight, we are very close to a drawing rook endgame. And indeed, after queen e5, rook to g8, just defending the mate first. But of course, they are in a pin now. The knight can't really move. h3, queen to a check first. King f2, bishop takes, rook takes. White's major pieces are pretty strong, but c3. Either queen takes, and this enters a relatively straightforward draw with the rook having too many targets. If, for example, rook e6, then this is the point. Despite having an extra pawn, because these are likely to liquidate off, and then, as we'll see, we'll have a 3 versus 2 endgame, which is one of the most trivial rook endgames to draw, especially for world champions. This would be a draw. And if instead b takes, keeping the queens on, then queen takes a3. Black, of course, is not a pawn down now, 4 versus 4. But with queens on, there's some small chances. But Ding Liren really did manage it quite well. Queen b3, just keeping his king active, saying to white, if you try and do a Nigel Short-esque marching of the king up, firstly, it doesn't necessarily do too much. But most importantly, this pawn can run and this queen will have a bunch of checks. It's quite central, even if it looks off to the side. So rook e7, maintaining the attack. But the march of the a-pawn is such a big distraction, it's hard. This doesn't really achieve much. Meanwhile, this, of course, if given 3 moves, will be becoming a queen. And so rook b7, rook's behind the passed pawns. Queen c4, offering a trade. And of course, if the queens come off, it's an immediate theoretical draw. Queen e5, queen c6, just hitting and hitting. Queen takes b5. And after queen takes c3, rook a7, Black threw in a check, move their queen to b4, trade it off, and in this moment we reach the aforementioned 3 versus 2. White, Gukesh, tried for a little bit more. Of course, he had every right to, and as well, very much would have wanted to just come to terms with the fact that it was becoming a draw. And ultimately, with this rook being so active, as we're seeing, White can never really push the pawns without the rook causing mischief, and it's very hard to prove any advantage. And indeed, after navigating some small pitfalls, such as in this moment, h5 is a very nice check. If the king ever takes, the one pawn comes off, the fewer pawns on the board, the closer it is to a draw, aside from the fact that this king is now tethered to the h5 square, and you're not winning if your king is sidelined. So the king did not capture after h5, went to f4, but then some checks occurred. The king going to g5 would result in exactly the same thing, the king being forced to h5 once more. So the king went back, and in this moment, a 3-fold repetition occurred on the board. So Ding Liren once again showing his high-class calculation despite the odds and securing a draw. Gukesh, of course, possibly a little bit disappointed that he didn't get a win, but nonetheless really putting it to the world champion, and of course going into the final round tomorrow, all to play for. Of course, Ding will have the white pieces in the final game versus Gukesh with the black pieces, and, well, all to play for in the final round. And if that is a draw, then, of course, tie breaks on Friday. All very exciting. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and tune in again tomorrow. Cheers.